Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to Understanding Fabric Certifications, Declarations, and Standards. My name is Lindsay DeSalvo, and I will be starting off this presentation today. I am a product manager for fabrics here at Texstyle with more than 13 years experience in the textile development industry. For anyone on the call who may not be too familiar with our company, Textile is the fabric division of Rollease Acmeda. Textile was originally an Australian roller shade fabric supplier until the late 2018 when Rollease Acmeda acquired the company to expand it into the US, and here we are. I'm excited to have with me today a guest speaker who is a consultant and sustainable materials specialist. Her name is Denise Staff. Denise is a founding member of the Center for Corporate Performance and Sustainability. She is a lead accredited professional for building design and construction since 2002, and she is a Fitwel ambassador. Today, about halfway through this presentation, Denise is going to be taking a deeper dive into explaining some of the more complicated declarations that you may have seen throughout the window coverings industry. Our contact info is on the screen. Feel free to reach out to either of us if you have any inquiries after the webinar. First, let's start with some general webinar housekeeping. All attendees are muted by default to ensure there's no distracting background noise. In the webinar control panel on your screen, you'll see a section titled Handouts. I have added a handout there for you that I like to call our Fabric Certification Matrix and Certification Brief document. You can easily download this to your computer at any time during the presentation. I will be reviewing it in detail at the end of the presentation. And if there's time at the end, we'll have a short Q&A period. Please use the question box in the control panel to submit any questions at any point during the presentation. If we don't get to your question today, we'll follow up with you after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed to you in the next couple of business days. All right, thank you for joining us, and let's get started. As for the order of things today, I'm going to start with talking about 3 commonly used certifications in the window coverings industry. We have GREENGUARD, we have Cradle to Cradle, and OEKO-TEX Standard 100. Then Denise, our guest speaker, is going to talk to you about some important declarations, which includes HPDs, EPDs, LBC's Red List, the HHI list, CDPH, and California Prop 65. If you don't know what some of or all of those acronyms stand for, good news, that's what we're here to tell you. After all that, I'm going to come back to you and discuss phthalates, a couple of ISO standards, and the ECO specifier standard, and then last but not least, the handout, the fabric certification matrix and brief. Okay, starting with GREENGUARD. So you can recognize when product has GREENGUARD or GREENGUARD Gold certification. If it has this logo you see here in the top right corner of your screen, that means it has that certification. GREENGUARD is a certification that identifies products that have low chemical emissions. It does this by screening products for more than 10,000 volatile organic compounds, also known as VOCs. Those volatile organic compounds are chemicals that are found within a solid or liquid that emit gas into the air at ordinary room temperatures. So what GREENGUARD is doing is essentially subjecting the fabric to a 14-day test period and then screening that air for chemicals. Why is this important? Well, okay, so since VOCs are chemicals that emit at room temperature, there's a lot of people that want to know if a product is going to make dangerous amounts of pollutants in the air of their living room or office space. GREENGUARD conducts their VOC testing to a standard called CDPH. CDPH stands for California Department of Public Health. Our guest speaker, Denise, is going to dive into that a little bit more later, so I won't do that right now. GreenGuard. Some of you are familiar with LEED. If you're familiar with LEED, GreenGuard was used actually as the first basis for establishing LEED credits some time ago, but now that's no longer the case. Instead, LEED has actually gone more direct to the source of using that CDPH standard test method directly. And that can be conducted by any certified lab. It doesn't need to be through GreenGuard. So let's recap. You have GreenGuard that tests to the CDPH test method. And some others, or you have a certified lab that can test to CDPH. At the end of the day, the product is being nearly tested the same way. The downside is that GreenGuard expires after 5 years and requires paying again to renew for the same results, while a test report for CDPH wouldn't expire. Now, what is GreenGuard Gold? Having GreenGuard Gold means that the fabric meets their stricter chemical emission limits. It's the best GreenGuard result you can achieve. You achieve this status if that CDPH test method yields a total VOC result of 0.5 milligram or less per cubic meter of air. Did you get all that? That's very little total VOCs in the air. Nearly all of our commercial fire retardant fabrics have achieved a GreenGuard Gold status. Yay. The only exceptions are our fabrics Ambient and Anzio, which were just not tested to GreenGuard only because there are less popular commercial fabrics. Now let's talk about what a cradle-to-cradle certification is. Cradle-to-cradle is a system of scoring a product along with its life cycle for its sustainability commitment to the circular economy. To receive certification, products are assessed for their environmental and social performance across 5 categories. First category, material health. This category is meant to assess if the chemicals being used are as safe as possible for humans and the environment. The second category is material reutilization. That assesses the reuse of materials during the production process. When the consumer is done with the product, how reusable or recyclable is that product? Can it be broken down into a smaller form and used for something completely different? Textiles, for example, can be sent to, say, a flocking industry to be used to produce filling material for furniture padding or speakers or car insulation, things like that. So that's all good stuff to get Cradle to Cradle certified because it's not going into a landfill. The third category is renewable energy and carbon management. This category assesses if products are manufactured using renewable energy sources in order to reduce climate changing greenhouse gases during manufacturing. Some examples of renewable energy sources would be solar energy, wind power, hydroelectricity, things like that. Next is the water stewardship category. This category assesses how water that is used during the manufacturing process is managed, recycled, disposed of, all that good stuff. And the fifth and final category is social fairness. This category assesses business operations to ensure that they're responsible and fair for everyone involved, including those in the supply chain and the environment, the workers, everybody. Here, I'm showing you an example of a cradle-to-cradle scorecard. Down the left side of the scorecard, you can see all 5 of the categories I just mentioned, and then you will see that each category is assigned an achievement level to the right. In this example, a variety of levels were achieved across all categories. Some categories have bronze, some have silver, some have gold. A product's lowest category achievement level represents its overall certification. So let's say this was a roller shade fabric. We can only say that this is Cradle to Cradle bronze certified because that's its lowest achievement level. Some of you might be wondering if we have any fabrics that hold a Cradle to Cradle certification. We currently stock a high performing fabric called EnviroScreen, which holds a Cradle to Cradle bronze certification. EnviroScreen is a specialty weave screen that we have that is 100% polyester and has an aluminized back. That means it is PVC free. And due to the aluminized back, It also has some outstanding solar optical properties you're going to want to know more about. So you can request that information from your sales rep or customer service rep if you're interested. Next, we have the most difficult to pronounce certification. This is OEKO-TEX Standard 100. Achieving this certification just means that all components of the product have been tested for potentially harmful chemicals, and the limit values for any potential harmful substances have not been exceeded. OEKO-TEX establishes their own limit values for each chemical. That shouldn't scare you. That's actually good. In many cases, those OEKO-TEX limit values go beyond national and international requirements. They test for regulated substances and also non-regulated substances that have actually been known to be problematic to human health. Some of those chemicals that they test for are formaldehyde, lead, other heavy metals, pesticides, phthalates, harmful flame retardants, odors, asbestos, dyestuffs that are classified as allergenics, VOCs, and many, many more. Take a look at the label at the top right of your screen. You may have seen this pop up in retail stores more and more. I know I have. It's not just in the window coverings industry. You can find OEKO-TEX certification in all types of textile products, primarily apparel, bedding, towels, things like that that touch your skin. I have recently seen it on bedding and apparel in Target, and I actually just bought a towel from Kohl's that happened to have this certification as well. But you would not see this certification on hard goods, say a piece of electronics or a kitchen utensil or a broom, for lack of a better example. Just items that are or contain a significant portion of fabric can be OEKO-TEX certified. The extent of the testing methods and requirements that are used depends on how the product is intended to be used. So OEKO-TEX has created 4 buckets for how a product will be used, and they call those buckets product classes. So depending on which class your product falls into will determine how rigorously it gets tested. So the first product class is items that would be for babies and infants up to a year and a half. This class is subject to the most rigorous testing and highest standards of them all. And then you have class 2, which is items that are in direct contact with the skin, maybe bedding or towels. And product class 3 is textiles that have little to no skin contact. And class 4 would be furnishing materials for decorative purposes, and that's us, right? That's the window coverings industry would fall into class 4. We have 28 fabric styles here at Texstyle that have been submitted for OEKO-TEX Standard 100 testing, and all 28 of those materials have achieved their certification. So that's good stuff. Okay, now we're going to move on to some declarations, which Denise, our guest speaker, is going to talk to you about. Go ahead, Denise.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lindsay. That was really good. I do not know much about that OEKO-TEX, so that was interesting to learn. I'm going to be on the lookout at Target for those. So I'm so excited to be here with Rollease Acmeda and share this information with you. Now, I say a lot of this stuff all the time, so please, if I skim over something and you have a question, probably other people do because I've missed something in just my talking and always saying it. So please put it in the question box because I'm sure if you have the question, there are lots of other people that have the question on the call. So let's talk about declarations. So what is a declaration versus a certification? A certification says that someone is going to put their name on the line and they are going to say that your product has these attributes. So look at, for instance, GREENGUARD. GREENGUARD is saying, yes, I am going to put my name, GREENGUARD, on the fact that you have achieved this test result and therefore your product has this result. So at the end of the day, they are saying it's their reputation, it's their name that is giving you that premier product status in the market. And that's what they're hoping for, that people see GREENGUARD and say, oh, I know I can trust them, and therefore I'm going to be able to say, I know that's low VOC. So a declaration is a manufacturer declaring something about their product. Now, they declare it based on some kind of scientific result, but they are declaring it themselves. So it's their name that's going on the line. And we'll talk a little bit more about what they need to do to put their name on the line. But a declaration is not somebody certifying a product. There's no HPD certification. There's manufacturers declaring their ingredients through the HPD transparency platform. So I just want to make sure everyone's aware of that first. So it's not a certification, and many times it can be third-party verified, but it's not always required. HPD does have the option now of having a third-party verified HPD, but to get lead credit, you currently do not require. It's not required. It's an additional point if you do, but it's not required. And an HPD, what it's simply doing is, I call it a fancy MSDS sheet times a recipe. So what it is it's declaring the chemical composition of a product, no matter what it is, prepared by the manufacturer or a person authorized to do it. And they're literally listing out to 100 parts per million, which is 0.01%, what is in a product. Now, that sounds easy, but actually it can get very, very complicated, because let's say a manufacturer of a fabric is using a chemical for to keep the polymer from sticking in the manufacturing process, just as an example. Well, they can't just say, okay, it's this chemical, because when you're doing this, you have to break it to the smallest level of the substance. So if, let's say, a manufacturer has a flame retardant, they can't just put the name of the flame retardant. They've got to say what's in that flame retardant. The flame retardant is, you know, this, and this. So you're literally breaking it down to a very small part, which helps manufacturers to learn a lot about their product and what is actually in it. This is the number one thing I always suggest manufacturers to start with, because A, they learn a lot, and B, it really can be a roadmap for so many other sustainability initiatives around that product, because you can find hazardous substances, you can find substances that you didn't even know were in that product, and you're like, oh, I didn't know. For instance, I had someone whose product popped for formaldehyde in a VOC test, and they said, but we don't put formaldehyde in our product. Well, as it turns out, one of the chemicals of their supplier that they're using has some formaldehyde in it. So they never knew, they're not using it, but it doesn't mean it's not in their supply chain. So this is a valuable, valuable document for manufacturers to do, but it's also valuable for specifiers. And I'm going to show you how to read a couple of really valuable things on that. So this screens materials and substances using the green screen methodology. So first of all, what's a material versus a substance? A material, according to an HPD, is your flame retardant. A substance is the smallest chemical level, which has what's called a CAS number, a chemical abstract number, a registry number. And so that might be formaldehyde, for instance. 50-00-0 is formaldehyde. And so that's called a substance. What the chemical that formaldehyde is in is called the material. So that's just a point for you there. Oh, Lindsay, next slide, please. I just tried to move it and it wouldn't move. So here's what an HPD looks like. And in the very beginning, it also gives you a lot of information: the type of product, what class it is, its description, what kind of inventory it is. And LEED requires nested material inventory, and you want it to be based on the product. And I like to see manufacturers do 100 parts per million because that's 0.01. But you are only required to do 1,000, but I like to see 100. Um, Impurities and residuals, that's a whole nother discussion. I'm not gonna go really into that. But it's gonna give you the basis of any material and its chemical products or properties in it. So if you could go to the next slide there, Lindsay, please. So one of the things I want to note, because I think for a manufacturer, this is, as I said, a valuable document, but I also think it's an incredibly valuable document for a specifier. There's any specifiers on the call? And why? So HPD was originally invented, so to speak, by the USGBC. And what they had a problem with was, if I'm an architect or a specifier and I'm designing a kindergarten and I want to make sure that there is no um, flooring that might have PVC in it that could, over abrasion, create dust that kids could eat, and there could be a problem because kindergartners are going to be on the floor. And so what they found was that's a very frustrating process because you would have to contact every flooring manufacturer and ask them for every MSDS, which a material safety data sheet, for every ingredient in their product. And then you might even have to ask those manufacturers for MSDS sheets for what's in their product to get a really good understanding of what was in the product. And so obviously that is a very convoluted process. And that was a quick answer on how the HPD was created. So one of the best things it tells you is it tells you about hazards. And as I said, it uses the green screen methodology, which is a rating system of sorts. And what it's going to tell you, I have a snapshot here of a chemical. And sometimes it will say the chemical, and sometimes it will say the word, as you see there in orange, undisclosed. So undisclosed means me as a manufacturer says that me using this chemical is my intellectual property. I have a great recipe and I don't want to share it with the world because this is how I make money. So I'm not going to tell you the name of the chemical, but I am going to tell you that I have screened it and here are the hazards. So even if you don't disclose its name, you are able to tell me about it. So what does this quickly tell me about it? It tells me where the information came from, which is HPD standard. It tells me when there was a screening date. Okay. It tells me how much of this chemical is in my fabric. In this case, it's a fabric. What its rating is. Now, this is the green screen score. And then if there's residuals, impurities, and what it is. So it's a pigment. Okay. So now let's go down to the hazard type. It says cancer, cancer, cancer. Who's calling it cancerous? The CDC for occupational carcinogens, the California EPA, Prop 65, and then IARC. I'm not sure who that it is. All these three places are calling it cancerous. But why is it cancerous? So the next column there to the right tells you why. Is it prolonged exposure? Because the way they do exposure is it's usually done on laboratory animals first, and then it would be done on humans. And they're looking at peer-reviewed, published scientific articles is how they're getting this information. And so in all three of these cases, it is an occupational carcinogen. So this pigment is shown to be cancerous due to its occupational route of exposure. Okay. And it's and here, and then the last one here says inhaled from occupational sources. So the reason why I bring this up is, let's say you're putting a flooring or a fabric and you see this and you're like, well, I don't want any cancerous substances in my product, but all three of your fabrics have this because it's a pigment. And so you say, now what do I do? Now you look at the route of exposure. As a window covering fabric, if there is a pigment mixed in a polymer and the only route of exposure is through inhalation in the occupational phase of making that, your occupational, the hazard at your level of being in the room of a customer is not going to produce a hazard. So it kind of lets you put that into perspective by reading those, because sometimes all of your choices, in this case, this just happens to be carbon black. So any kind of colorant that would be a little bit darker, and we're not talking just window covering fabrics, we're talking about paints, everything is going to have carbon black in it. Pretty sure the people who make carbon black are really addressing the cancerous inhalation at the occupational level, or else they wouldn't have any employees. So this is just a little bit on how to read that. Next slide, Lindsay, please. So if you have any questions, type them in the box on that. I know that's a lot of information. Next, we're going to talk about the declaration of declare and calling your product, all of a sudden I couldn't talk, sorry, calling your product red list compliant or red list free. So these are all declarations. And what do they mean? So the declare label is not a certified label. It is a transparency label. The only difference between declare and HPD is declare is produced by the Living Future Institute, and they are also declaring what kind of substances could be in your product, and if you have something on the red list. They do allow some exceptions, temporary exceptions. So they have a few little different rules where HPD is simply saying good, bad, or ugly, this is what's in it. You can't get a declare label if you've got some bad stuff in your product. And so this label is equal to an ISO 17050 conformity assessment. It's called a supplier's declaration of conformity. Anybody in Europe or who deals with products in that kind of market might already know what this is. This is a very common European document. So what this is doing is it's declaring your chemical composition again to 0.01, but it's also kind of declaring if you have something on the red list. Now the red list is a list of products, or I'm sorry, list of substances by the Living Future Institute that they feel are bad. There is scientific evidence to say that these are harmful to human health. Now, some of them have been declared by the governments, but some of them are simply the Living Future Institute's opinions about what is good versus what is bad. So they publish a list, and your product can be either red list compliant or red list free. To be red list free, you need to screen your materials to 0.01%. You need to name all of your materials. Remember on that previous document where it said undisclosed and they still screened it? To be red list free, I would have had to have called that carbon black. Okay, and so if I can have some exceptions, they have rules for those exceptions, and then I can say that I'm red list free. You can have a declare label, or you can have your own supplier declaration and say you're red list free if you want to name all your substances. If you don't want to name all your substances, okay, you can. I guess you can get a label regardless of toxicity. Somebody noted for me. I did not know that. I thought you had to be declared. So it is more like HPD. I don't do them because the Living Future Institute does, but I do HPD. So thank you, Melissa, for pointing that out, that you can get one even if you do have toxic substances. I had a conversation with someone from Declare and I thought they told me you couldn't. So thank you for correcting me. To be red list compliant, you also have to screen your materials to 0.01%, either through the Declare label or through your supplier declaration of conformity. But in this case, you can do the same as you did on the HPD. You can say that they are, there are some that are undisclosed, but in this case, I'm compliant because I have screened them and there's nothing on the list. The red list is a list of chemical substances. and some of it is their own. Okay, next category, or next slide, Lindsay, please. Thank you again for pointing that out. I don't do declare. So what is the equivalent? So if I'm a manufacturer and I don't want to do a declare label, what can I do if I want to say that my product is compliant? So you don't have they don't equate to each other. You can actually produce what is called a supplier declaration of conformity. And this is an ISO-based document. So ISO, I'm sure you've heard it and you'll hear it again at the end of the presentation. It's adopted by 182 countries overall as there being standards on how you do certain things like quality or environmental, or in this case is make a declaration. So what we're doing is making a declaration. It's called a self-declaration because there is nobody certifying this. I am making this on my own, but I do need to have some key things. I need to have who I am as being the supplier. It needs to be on company letterhead. It needs to be based in science. So there has to be some kind of backup. If somebody called me and said, how do I know that there is none of this in this fabric? I can say, not a problem. I can send you a test report. So there's got to be a backup to that. It just can't be like, oh yeah, I called around and they said yes. No, it has to be backed in science. There has to be a signature of a company representative, a unique identification number, a description of the product, a date, and if there's any limitations, like maybe only fabric that's 54 inches wide complies. In this case, no, there are no limitations. But as long as you have these kinds of things, you can actually make your own declaration of conformity. Per lead, it is going to do the same thing as a certified document would in the case of VOCs, in the case of Red List, in the case of recycled materials. You can simply do a supplier declaration and there will be, it will be an equal. LEED has gotten really good about that because they want you to do the science of your product so that you can comply. But manufacturers in the past had always complained that the certifications are usually a little bit more expensive. So for a mid-sized manufacturer, it isn't always doable that they can certify, but they can do the science. So that's kind of what that is for. Next slide, Lindsay. So another declaration is the Healthy Hospital Initiative, and this is a campaign that's meant to improve the health and sustainability in the healthcare industry. And they publish their own list as well. And their list, they want about 30% of the annual volume of furniture and furnishings to be based on this cost. But they don't list it by substances. Remember, substance was the lowest number, like formaldehyde. They list it by classes. So they haven't quite refined it into these, like the red list. None of these numbers chemicals with these numbers can be in your product. The Healthy Hospital Initiative is still getting started on that. So they say you can't use perfluorinated compounds. You can't use antimicrobials. You can't use flame retardants, which that's a very broad class. So you have to do a little bit more research on your product to find out if you have something in those classes. Now they do use some substances like formaldehyde. They do use PVC. They're banning everything that has to do with them, but everything on their list, if you go through it and you try to figure it out on your own, is a little bit frustrating because you need to really understand those classes and research what's in an antimicrobial class, how many different compounds. Perfluorinated compounds had about 68 different substances in it the last time I looked. So in order to comply with the HHI, what you need to do is you need to submit a document of your chemical screening. Oh boy, the HPD works great for that. So you submit the HPD along with a letter stating that you comply. Again, what did we just have? The supplier declaration of conformity. So it kind of goes back and forth where now you can submit two things that you already have and comply with this. Lindsay, next slide. Another declaration is a type 3 environmental product declaration, EPD. A lot of people have heard about this. This is kind of the holy grail of products for manufacturers to do. And I have a typo, I apologize, can be product specific or sector specific with multiple products. So for instance, you can do your specific fabric, or you can do all the fabric in a line made by different manufacturers. So it can be one or the other. LEED gives you more credit for product specific versus sector specific. The backbone of an EPD is a cradle to grave life cycle analysis plus a product category rule. Now, what is a product category rule? When you make an LCA, let's say for instance, a water bottle, I can make, as long as you follow ISO 14040 and 14044, you can actually make choices as the life cycle practitioner about how you want to do the life cycle. As long as you follow their loose guidelines, you can make your life cycle. So what happens is, just imagine a water bottle. Me as a life cycle practitioner, I say, I want to do everything about that water bottle. I want to do the bottle, I want to do the label, I want to do the ink on the label, I want to do the little bit of glue that attaches the label to the bottle, I want to do the cap. I'm doing everything. And so I make my life cycle to that. Lindsay's going to do one. And she said, you know what? All water bottles don't have labels. So I'm just going to do the bottle and the cap. And then we find one that somebody else did. And they said, yeah, the caps are always different. So I'm just going to do the bottle. And as long as we follow all of the guidelines of ISO 14040 and 44, they are all what you would call legal life cycles. But if you try to look at them across a product category, you would have to read every single one, analyze it, figure out what they included, what they didn't include, and that's very time consuming. So what a product category rule does is everything in a category goes, there's rules for that. And they say, okay, everything in the water bottle category must include this: the bottle, the cap, any inks that's used, it gives you the rules. So when you're looking at a document that's EPD, it's got a little bit more rules attached to it. And it's meant to, and it'll usually tell you which category is attached to it so that you can not compare, but you can kind of look across a category. Steps in the EPD: you have to gather all the documents, you have to perform an LCA, you have to have that LCA third-party verified, you have to put it in a very specific EPD format called out in the PCR, you have to have that third-party verified, and then the EPD needs to register with a program operator, and it's good for 5 years. So it's a lengthy process, and it's very time and labor intensive, and this is why it's kind of expensive for a lot of manufacturers. If you change something in the product, you got to do a lot of it again. So, $50,000, and maybe in 5 years, for sure, it's going to expire. But maybe in 3 years, you change something and you got to do it again. So, what's measured by an EPD? Why is it so great? And I can tell you, for the manufacturer, it is the holy grail of documents, because it is going to tell that manufacturer more about their product than they ever thought they were going to know. As part of it, you have to screen your materials to at least 1,000 parts per million. So you kind of get an HPD with that, but it also gives you so much more. The great thing about an EPD also is that it doesn't tell you whether you're good or bad. It is a true declaration. It's going to just say, this is what is. Next slide, Lindsay. And so here's an example. So it would say results for A1 to A3. So A1 is raw material, A2 is transportation, and A3 is manufacturing. And that's how they break it up in the EPD, so that you can see where your impacts are. And I didn't put a lot of impacts here because I didn't want you to get super confused. But here's the kinds of things that it's going to look at. So it's going to look at acidification, eutrophication, global warming, ozone depletion, photochemical ozone formation. Now, it's going to give you a bunch of numbers, right? So what does this tell me? Now, imagine on the left, that black box, I blacked out the names of the materials. But let's say material 1 versus material 2 versus material 3 versus material 4. What does it tell me about these materials? Well, material 4 and material 5, the last row, has the greatest impact, right? So what do these mean? Global warming. Throughout the process of raw material extraction, transportation to the manufacturing, and manufacturing, this is telling me that that much impact is happening in global warming, kilograms of CO2. What that tells me as a life cycle person is there's a lot of energy. Either the manufacturing, and I didn't break this out by the different categories, either the manufacturing or the transportation or the raw material is using a lot of energy somewhere. So you either have a big supply chain coming from China being trucked across the United States, or you have a very labor intensive or a very energy intensive product to produce. So this is telling me that product 5 versus product 1 is much more energy intensive somewhere in the process, because it's got a much higher global warming potential. Now, if you move to the left, you see kilograms of nitrogen. And so what does that say? Well, that's actually telling me the amount of water that might become polluted as a consequence of this product being made. I usually see that when somebody has a supply chain coming from China. So the boat coming from China is actually dripping oil and waste and things in the ocean as it's making its transoceanic truck to the United States. So it's actually putting things in the water. And so you're going to have a high amount here. Photochemical ozone is usually going to be a lot of truck transportation because you're creating ozone with the emissions from the truck. So that's just an example of these numbers actually mean something, but what they're showing you is in numbers where your impacts really are. Okay, next slide, Lindsay. The California Department of Public Health, CDPH version 1.2, is a test method. And the way that this came about was the city Sacramento government was trying to build a building, and they did a bunch of studies about the health of the employees, the air that they were breathing. And their study had more to do than just VOCs. It had to do with line of sight to outside. It actually was the basis for a lot of LEED credits. But the one that they found out the most was the VOCs had a very direct impact on how the health of the employees. And so they actually adapted a previous standard for VOCs and decided that everything needed to be tested. It's a 14-day test in a closed chamber. And GreenGuard's going to use the same test as the basis of their certification. But what they're going to do is they're going to give you a range of values. So it's called TVOC. Your total VOCs are 0.5 milligrams per meter cube or less, between 0.5 and 5, or greater than 5 milligrams per meter cubed. And anytime you see milligrams per meter cubed, that actually means that amount of VOCs in the volume of air you breathe. So if you look on a can of paint or stain or something like that, it'll tell you amount of VOCs in it, usually in milligrams, not always, but there's no meter cubed because it's telling you the amount of VOCs in that can. It's not telling you the amount that is in the volume of air that you breathe. So that is that one. And the benefits of CDPH versus GreenGuard is it's guaranteed science and it doesn't expire. So you can use the CDPH for California Proposition 65, and you could do a range of declarations for it. With GreenGuard, that you're just getting the GreenGuard name. So actually, I like the self-declaration with the CDPH because you're actually going to see the science every time. This is exactly what we did. This is exactly what our results were. This is exactly what happened. They're going to issue you a certificate, and you can even be put in the ClearChem database. That's going to be CDPH tests. and be able to see manufacturers in there as well. Next slide. So California Proposition 65 is actually a law. It's actually not a declaration, but it's kind of a declaration. So as part of the Safe Water and Drinking Act, Toxic Enforcement Act of 1986, not only does it apply to drinking water, but it applies to all of California's sources of contamination. The law essentially says that as a California resident, you should know where your sources of contamination are coming from. And so therefore, anybody who is contaminating something, they should have to label it or notify you. If you've ever lived in California or you've ever been to someplace in California and you're in a bar and you notice there's a sign on the wall that says, you know, something in this building could cause cancer or reproductive harm if they serve alcohol, then that's actually essentially what it is. So it was meant for the water and safe drinking water, but it kind of was loosely written and got expanded to lots of things. And it requires the state to maintain a list of chemicals, and you can join the toxicologists as they discuss it. They openly like if you show up and want to hear about their chemicals, but they're going to maintain a list. And if you have something on the list, you need to notify the resident. So, but you need to notify them about exposure. The key thing here is just because your product has something in it doesn't mean you're exposed to it. You have to consider the route of exposure. So if your route of exposure for VOC is air, the chemical composition of what is in that fabric, unless you're going to eat the fabric, isn't the concern. The concern is what is coming off of that fabric in a VOC. The only time I would think that the composition, well, it'd be two times, that the composition might equal exposure is if you eat it or you put it on your skin, okay? But that thing is to consider when you're looking at exposure is, like, for instance, Rollease Acmeda has a declaration. Thanks, Jess, or thanks, Lindsay. And this is what it says. This was the exposure done on a chemical that's actually formaldehyde, and it's done over a lifetime. And then these appear on Rollease's site, and they are listing that the exposure level is not warranting a label. And I think that's the end of my declarations. I'll take questions at the very end.
Okay. Thank you, Denise. That was
Sorry if
awesome.
that was a lot of information.
It's okay. Certifications, I think everyone is expecting it. So this is great. Oh, went a little too far. Okay. Okay. Next, I'm going to talk to you about phthalates and why phthalates are harmful. Phthalates are near and dear to my heart. So what are phthalates? Phthalates are a group of chemicals used to make plastics more flexible or harder to break. Phthalates are everywhere, and they're in almost everything because of the large amount of plastic that we use. Phthalates are in cosmetics, soaps, medical tubing and bags, detergents, adhesives, building materials, food, and in the air we breathe. And they're in food because of how food is packaged and processed, not because it just comes in the food. Are they harmful? Well, because the term phthalates represents a group of chemicals, they don't all behave the exact same way. Some are worse than others. So for today, and for the sake of talking about what's relevant to our industry, I'm going to talk about DEHP, di-2-ethylhexyl phthalate. I'm not going to try and say that again. So DEHP is the specific phthalate used to soften PVC. And PVC, as most of you know, can sometimes be found in the window covering industry in solar screens. Solar screen is often made up of yarns that are coated in the PVC, and DEHP might be used to help soften it. Is DEHP, or yeah, DEHP, getting my acronyms confused. Are they harmful? Yes. So there have been numerous studies on animals and limited studies on humans, but majority have shown that high levels of exposure to DEHP can cause cancer, birth defects, and harm to the male reproductive system. None of that's good. You can be exposed to DEHP or any phthalate for that matter through swallowing it or consuming foods that use it, through the packaging or processing of the food, or from undergoing medical procedures that use the equipment containing DEHP. But the big one is breathing in air and dust that contains DEHP. How might it get into the air? Well, one example is if your solar screen fabric contains DEHP, it will off-gas into your home or office. The phthalate DEHP has already been banned from California, um, from all US children's toys and childcare items. It is banned entirely throughout Europe, but it is not banned in the US window coverings industry yet. So regardless, I want to share that we at Texstyle have made a conscious decision to ensure that our solar screens, such as 3000 net, 3000 HT, 4000 net, Xweave, which is our external screen, can also be used indoors, do not use this phthalate, DEHP. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because you should be aware that there are other solar screens currently being sold in the US market that do use DEHP in them, and they use them because why not? I mean, there's no real incentive for companies to do the right thing and not use them. And while there are alternatives to soften the PVC, those alternatives are far more expensive. Screen is a competitively priced product these days. And to remain competitive, many manufacturers are using the cheapest chemicals and materials in the market. That includes DEHP for some. Um, I do know that there's one rather large US company for solar screen that is currently selling solar screen with DEHP. Most of you have probably heard them before, but I'm not naming any names. Rather, I just want to say do your homework. Please find out if the solar screen you are using, if it's not ours, is DEHP free, or it says phthalate free, because there is a chance that it might not be. How can you avoid them? Just read product labels carefully and choose items labeled phthalate free, especially your solar screen. If a fabric uses DEHP, it can be found on an HPD document, what Denise was talking about earlier. You can go through there and you'll see in all caps DEHP right in those materials and substances. Just ask for the document. Okay. Now to the ISOs. First, we should go over what is an ISO. It stands for the International Organization for Standardization. They write standards and specifications for products, services, and good practice, helping to make industry more efficient and effective. Manufacturers are then tested and assessed to those standards, and there are many of them. Denise mentioned some earlier. I'm going to talk to you about two more of them, the first being ISO 14001. If a manufacturer is certified to ISO 14001, it means that the manufacturer has met the requirements of showing that they are controlling and improving the impacts that their activities or products, services have on the environment. This standard outlines how to conduct life cycle analysis, how to operate more efficiently and effectively in environmental terms, and how to make environmental statements about your product. Next, we'll go to ISO 9001, which is a manufacturing quality standard. If a manufacturer is certified to ISO 9001, it means that the manufacturer has met the quality management system requirements by demonstrating their commitment to quality, customer satisfaction, and continuous improvement of operations. Why do we need these? So these were originated because they wanted to try to break down trade barriers where there might be countries that have stereotypes, negative stereotypes against them, or areas for quality or for environmental impacts that they have. So, this implies quality and trust in the manufacturer that is making those products. And now let's talk about the last certification on our list for today, called Eco Specifier. Many people haven't heard of it. It's not huge in the United States, but you might find it here and there. I'm mentioning it because one of our fabrics does happen to carry this certification. That is our EnviroScreen fabric. So I want to make sure I touch on what it actually means. Um, the organization, Eco-Specifier, originated in Australia in 2003 and became global in 2012. But it still has not really infiltrated other markets as much as it has in Australia, which is why, like I said, you probably haven't heard of it before. Eco-Specifier tests to ensure that all products' eco-claims and self-declarations are true and meet the claim guidelines for statements, symbols, graphics. Denise was talking about an ISO earlier that is very similar. It was a slightly different number than the ISO that Eco-Specifier uses. The standards that Eco-Specifier follows for making proper eco claims are ISO 14021 and ACCC Environment Claims Guidelines. Eco-Specifier guarantees to consumers and professionals that all key manufacturer health and environmental claims are third-party verified. They also have some other benefits. They have an online database of green building materials that builders, architects, and governments can choose from. And they also provide education and training materials for green building design. Okay, so I know we just threw a ton of information at you. I hope some of it stuck, but in case you need a little help remembering after we leave the webinar, I have made this handout for you to use as a cheat sheet. This is the one that you can download in the control panel on the right side of your screen. It's 2 pages. So the first page I'm showing you here is a grid of all the fabrics we currently carry in our stocked open line. The check marks indicate which attributes, certifications, and declarations apply to each fabric. Pretty self-explanatory. You can use it as a quick reference guide if, for example, you have a job you need to spec that's looking for a very specific requirement like LBC Red List compliant, and you would just look at the gray column on the left and find the criteria you need, and then quickly scan to the right to see what fabrics we have that meet the criteria. Our website also has a search function that is very similar to this. That's kind of actually how this originated. So you can search specifically for Red List compliant, and then the search engine will just give you all of our fabrics that apply to that. Here we have page 2 of the document of the handout, which you can download. And this is a brief overview of all of the certifications and declarations that we hold on our fabrics. All of them we talked about today, but I didn't include everything we talked about today because not everything we talk about today is something we necessarily have on our specific fabrics. Again, it's meant to simply be a cheat sheet for what all of this fun stuff means, and I encourage you to keep it close by to use as a reference tool in your day-to-day. I hope some of you find it useful. Next week, this document will also be put up on our fabric website, texstyle.com, and our Rollease contract website for you to download. Well, everyone, that's the end of what we have prepared for you this afternoon. It looks like we have some time for a question or two. I'm going to pass you back over to Denise, our expert guest speaker, and she will answer any questions that were asked in the questions window. And if we cannot get to your questions here because we only have 2 minutes, we will email you a reply shortly after. But just before I pass you off to Denise, I want to mention the upcoming webinars that our Rollease Acmeda contract team will actually be presenting next week. On Monday, they'll be walking you through our Rollease Acmeda contract website. On Wednesday, they will be providing an overview of our commercial product range. And on Friday, they will be talking about making some extreme shades. So you are not going to want to miss them. Make sure you check it out.
Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Someone is asking me about the EPD, and does the higher number always equal a higher impact? Yes. And so if you can make it back to that slide, Lindsay, I can, with the numbers on it, It's the one after the EPD. I can talk about that for 1 minute. I have 1 minute. So with that slide, what it's going to show you is the category, and in the next slide forward. In the EPD, it's going to tell you what each one of these mean. These are called TREACY. These are U.S. impacts done by the U.S. EPA. And so it's going to tell you what each one of these mean, and then it's going to give you its measurement. So this is CO2 equivalent, which is how CO2 is measured. And so it's going to tell you what, how many kilograms of CO2 equivalent for each, and the top box will also tell you the standard product. So it may be a kilogram of product, it may be a yard of fabric. It's going to tell you what it's called, its functional unit is. So for every functional unit, it's going to tell you how many, in this case, kilograms of O3 ozone or CFC11 are that product is producing. So yes, the higher the number, the higher the impact. Most definitely. And I think we're exactly 3 o'clock now, Linz.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend.
Thank you, Lindsay, for putting this on. This is
Oh,
great.
and thank you, Denise. Thank you for joining us.